So excited to be back in Philippians. Of course, we are in Philippians, still in chapter 1. Don't worry, we will get through chapter 1 eventually. Last week, we covered a series of verses that, at least in my experience, I don't ever hear taught. You hear people read them, and they go right to one very popular verse in this section, which is chapter 1, verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And the verses that go before it are like, we just read them to get to that one big point, that mission statement of Paul. Last week, we talked about chain reaction. The chain reaction, as Paul's chains, his circumstances, created a conflict in the community. What do you mean? There were a community of believers that were supporting Paul, and others were kind of taking advantage of his absence in ministry for their own sake. Now, at the end of them preaching Christ, some from selfishness and strife, the other camp out of love and free will, the people who were concerned about Paul, this would have been their question. Hey, Paul, did you hear that ministry down the street is talking badly about you? They're saying that everywhere you go, you bring tension and chaos, and you're bringing attention on yourself. What do you have to say about that? And Paul said, so what? So what? Are they preaching Christ down the street? Are they preaching Christ over the bridge? Then it don't make a difference. As long as they're preaching Christ, it don't matter what they said about Coastal Christian. It doesn't matter what they said about that crazy teaching pastor, Matthew Maher. It makes no difference. As long as Jesus Christ is on their tongue, then I can rejoice. That's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, I'm going to rejoice. As long as Jesus is being promoted, elevated, I can rejoice in that. Today's verses are a continuation from that thought. So with that thought in mind, that as long as Jesus Christ is being elevated, promoted, propagated, talked about, Paul is able to write verse 19. For I know that this, the propagation of Jesus Christ, will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Now notice, he's saying, I know that this is going to turn out to my deliverance. Now, is he speaking about being delivered from his imprisonment? Yes. Is he speaking about being delivered from eternal damnation and condemnation? Yes. Is he speaking about being vindicated by God based on his testimony in life? Yes. Which one does he want to put more stock in? Nobody knows. He didn't know. Because as the text unfolds, he's saying, hey, if I get out of here, my ministry is going to reap fruit for Jesus. If I don't get out of here and my life ends in here, my life is going to magnify Jesus. Whether it's life or death, it makes no difference because I have found the secret to life. And it's by living for Christ, and death is even considered gain. That's what we're going to get to tonight. But before we get there, it's interesting to note that the word deliverance here, actually, this exact phrase, Paul would write, I know this will turn out for my deliverance, is the same phrase that Job said in the book of Job in chapter 13, verse 16, where he's literally trying to figure out why are all these things happening to him? Why did he lose his children? Why did his wife leave him? Why is he plagued with a sickness? Why did he lose all of his stock? Why did he lose all of his possessions? And his friends come alongside of him and are like, Job, it's got to be something in your past. It's got to be something that you're covering up in private. It's got to be something. And Job says, listen, though he slay me, I will still trust him. And then he says, he shall be my salvation. It's the same word, deliverance. In the Hebrew, this is interesting. He shall be my salvation. The word is, he shall be my, Hebrew, Yeshua. He shall be my, Greek, Jesus. It's prophecy. Job is saying thousands of years before Jesus would be born as a man, he is saying he is my Savior. But he's saying it in reference to, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I know that I will be vindicated. That if I was to stand before God right now, that God would be the judge, and I am clear of anything that you are saying against me. That's what Job was saying. That's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, my conscience is clear. You know why? There were people saying some foul stuff about Paul why he was in prison in the first place. There were people saying some foul stuff about Paul because there was so much attention around him. And he was saying, I know this, because of your prayers, church, you're praying for me, and because of the supply of the Holy Spirit, the word supply is an overabundance of resources given to Paul in his confinement. He's saying, I know two things, your prayer and the Holy Spirit, it's going to lead to my deliverance. Now, again, he's confident that he might get out of prison, but he's saying, I know this, that my life is not going to shame Jesus Christ. That's what that word deliverance means. Write that down. Deliverance means that my life in any given circumstance will not bring shame to Jesus Christ. What do you mean? It means when you're in a tight spot, when you're in a circumstance that doesn't feel good, it doesn't look good. You know how easy it is to literally talk badly about God? You might not actually say it, but interpretation of, man, it stinks that's going on in your life, believer. Yeah, I know. We're saying, God, you don't know what you're doing. We're subtly saying, God, I don't trust you for allowing this into my life. Now, people might not admit that, but when we talk about God, like he doesn't know what he's doing in your life because you're going through a tragedy or a trial, we're doing it at his expense. Now, I don't know about you and the families you come from, but I'm one of 4 boys, and I wouldn't be in any circle, in anywhere, and allow anybody to talk badly about my father. You can't talk about my daddy like that. You don't know him. But we do that when we allow people who are believers to talk badly about our Father in heaven. Paul's saying, my life is not going to put shame to Jesus Christ. He's understanding this word in Greek, soteria, which is the full orb of God's salvation. We believe that salvation is just something that I'm going to get for eternity. But God said, no, it's something that I'm giving you presently. Salvation is a possession that I have today to help me navigate my day. Salvation is prosperity spiritually. Prosperity leads to victory. It's this very faith that I have today, here and now, no matter where I'm at, no matter what I'm going through, that allows me to realize I'm free. Because the supply of the Spirit, watch this, Paul would write to the Corinthians later on, for the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So what type of deliverance are you looking for today? And if it doesn't go the way you thought, is God not good? So to have confidence in the midst of our circumstances needs to be based on the right deliverance. Let me give you some context. Confidence in the midst of any given circumstance. It has to be based on the right deliverance. What do I mean? So many of us are just simply worried about getting out. I need to be delivered. I need to get out of these circumstances. I need God to get me out of my trouble. I need God to get me out of my debt. I need God to fix this. And God's saying, I can't do that until you let me fix you. I can't deliver you out of it until you let me work in you, within it. What do I mean? Interesting. Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 to 18, there was a decree that went out that soon as any musical presentation, all types of instruments were blown, the people had to bow to a statue in honor of the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And it says 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were seen not bowing. Now, I love it because there are tattletales. They go to the king and say, hey, these 3 Hebrew boys, they're not bowing. And the king gives them an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that starts like this. Hey, if you do not fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Same word. You're not going to bow? I'll give you an opportunity. That's a whole nother message, how we would justify in our mind, I'll bow now, but I'll stand for Christ later. I'll fit in now because I don't want to get fired. If I get fired, then I can't testify for Jesus. Look at their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Verse 18. But if not, Let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Did you get that? We will not bow down to the world. We will not bow down. And we believe our God can deliver us. But even if he doesn't, even if he chooses to keep me in the circumstances I'm in, even if he chooses to not heal me of the cancer, even if he chooses to leave me in my pain, I still won't sell him out. I still will trust him, and I still will worship him. You know, during the World War II, they found so many different stories and testimonies of families and individuals who held their faith in the most trying of times. Talk about straight persecution. Out of one household, a French family who held a Jewish family in their basement for months. They only would come out for a couple seconds a day to get sunlight, and they would have to go back down. After they were freed, they found these words inscripted on the basement wall. I believe in the sun even if I don't see it shine. I believe in love even if I don't see that it's given. And I believe in God even if he chooses to remain silent. Do you still believe in God even if he leaves you in your circumstances you're currently in? Do you still believe he's good if he's not answering your one prayer that you keep praying about? Are you able to trust him that in your waiting, he is still working? See, our deliverance and the confidence within our circumstance has to be based on the right deliverance. Paul gets it in verse 20. He says, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing, here it is, I shall be ashamed, but with boldness, as always, so now also, Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. That phrase, whether by life or death, is what led me to title this message, The Best of Both Worlds. Because believers should have the best of both life and, yes, death. But why did he say, my earnest expectation and hope, again, of being delivered? The earnest expectation, it actually describes an individual who's waiting for somebody to return from a trip. And they're waiting with bent neck as they're looking around the corner. You ever did that? You're waiting for somebody? And the word hope attached to earnest expectation, it means this: absolute expectation of coming good. That's what hope is. That's why people are able to have hope in the most horrible circumstances. They have an absolute expectation of a coming good. What is the coming good? It's that God is working things together for the good and his glory. Now here, Paul's saying, I know this much. I'm going to be hopeful that my life is not going to shame Christ. And I'm going to be bold in my testimony. I'm not going to compromise. I am confident that I'm going to magnify him, whether by my life or my death. Matthew 10:32, Jesus said these words. He who confesses me before men, I will confess him or her before my Father in heaven. But he who denies me before men, I will deny them in front of my Father. That's a powerful word from the Lord. Pastor Matt always says that's not just one confession in front of people. It's a constant life of confession, a life that is constantly confessing Jesus. Not only verbally, a life that is confessing him visually. Isaiah would say it like this: those who hope in the Lord will not be put to shame. Listen, those who have a hope, an absolute expectation of coming good, will not be put to shame. And then eventually in Psalm 119:80, we are told this: let my heart be blameless regarding your statutes, that I may not be ashamed. There's a connection here. What's the connection? That being blameless, boldness. Being blameless makes up the substance of boldness. What do I mean? I mean, when you're blameless, when you don't have to look over your shoulder, when you have a clear conscience, when you're doing what God has called you to do, that makes you bold for Jesus. When you aren't bold for Jesus, most likely you're not blameless. Most likely there's something in your life that you're trying to cover or hide. And Paul is saying, I got none of that. My life is going to be constant and consistent, and it's going to magnify Jesus. There was a little boy. He was on actually the court stand giving testimony, and he was doing really good up to this point. The lawyer finally, actually the cross-examining lawyer, thought he would be able to trip him up. He said, young boy, did your father tell you to testify in this manner? And the boy said, yes. They all looked at each other, thinking they had him or they wanted him. And what is it that your father told you to say? The little boy said, well, my father told me that you would try to tangle me in my testimony. And he told me as long as I told the truth, no matter how many times I told my story, it would always be the same. You understand? As long as I'm living the truth constantly and consistently, blameless leads to boldness, it will always be the same presentation. Now, I'm not saying we're not going to have bad days. I'm not going to say we're not going to have a bad attitude. I'm not saying we're not going to come out of character. But what I am saying, by and large, when we're with the Lord and His Word, it says, I don't have to be put to shame. When I'm with the Lord and His Word, it says, I can be blameless. When I'm blameless, I'm bold. And when I'm bold, I don't got to worry about what people think about me because I'm doing it for the Lord. I'm not doing it for them. I don't care about their approval. I want to be like Paul and say, I'm doing this so you can be magnified in my body. So how do we do that? Let's look at verse 20 again. According to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also, even though I'm locked up, Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Here's the question. If Paul's primary priority was to glorify Christ, magnify God in his body, how do we do that? How do you magnify God in your body? Paul would write to the Romans, hey, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, let your bodies be living sacrifices, holy, acceptable, and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. And you say, wait, what does that got to do with my body? Every member of your body is used to either magnify God or put shame on Christ. Let's start with the ears. Is what we're listening to on a daily basis, is it magnifying Christ? If he was next to me, would I listen to that same radio station? Would I listen to that conversation? Is what my ears are open to, is it magnifying God or is it putting shame on him? How about our mouths? Is my conversation pleasing to God? Is the things I'm talking about, are they magnifying Christ? Now, I'm not always, people get it twisted. Being a believer doesn't mean you always have to be talking Bible. Jesus doesn't always have to be on your tongue verbally. But there should be a representation of him in truth and love and spirit. The things that we say that are fruitful. The things that we say that lead to life, not death. I'm going to magnify him in everything I say. And I fail. I failed a couple hours ago with my wife. I said things off my tongue that wouldn't magnify Christ. I put shame to him. How about our eyes, church? What are we looking upon? What are the things that we're glued to on our cell phones? How about that laptop screen, that computer? How about that late night talk show? How about that Netflix series? How about I'll just skip through the inappropriate part? What are our eyes looking upon? Is what my eyes gaze upon magnifying Christ? This is like so simple. I'm just putting it out there because it's a challenge for all of us. Is what I'm looking at in the world, is it putting shame on Christ or is it magnifying Christ? How about my hands? It's part of my body, right? Being a living sacrifice. Is what I'm doing with my hands magnifying Christ? The way I touch people, the way I lend a helping hand, the way I hug, the way I rub the back of somebody that is in need of a touch that's loving? Or am I using my hands to hurt? Husbands, putting your hands on your wife behind closed doors. Is that magnifying Christ? How about the things we do with our fingers? The text messages, the scrolling. Is scrolling through social media for hours a day, but I can't scroll through the Holy Scriptures for no amount of time. Is that magnifying Christ? It's real. Amen. Stuff you don't want to hear. What about my feet? Is where my feet take me magnifying Christ? How about my stance, what I stand for? That's all part of being a living sacrifice. That's all part of my body magnifying Christ. Now, of course, every part I just mentioned, every part is dictated or determined by the heart. The state of the heart is going to control what I look upon. The state of the heart is going to control what I listen to. The state of the heart is going to control what I talk about. The state of the heart is going to control what I put my hands on, where I take my feet. It's the heart that the Lord is after. It says in Proverbs, keep your heart with all diligence. Why? For out of your heart will flow every issue of your life. Paul is saying Christ will be magnified. That word is amazing, magnification. Now, I think of several things when I hear magnify. One, I think of a telescope. The telescope has come up recently in a lot of messages. They're all like on the same thread. The telescope, and I say, if I'm a telescope and my life is magnifying Christ, what does that look like? Well, if I think about what the telescope does, and I said this before, it takes things that are far off, things that you can't see with the naked eye, and it brings them into clearer view, doesn't it? And sometimes it makes what is very small in the sky appear larger when you look at it through the telescope. And I'm saying if my life is a telescope, my life should make Christ look more magnificent, more beautiful. He should be made larger. He should be brought closer. So when the world is gazing at me and say, what makes him different? Like a telescope, they think God is far off, but because of my testimony, my example, it brings him closer and more beautiful. Amen. How about a microphone? Without this microphone, you might not be able to hear me in the back. But it's taking my voice and it's magnifying it. So the point is this. The Christian is to bring God into clearer and closer view so as to make him reachable and more beautiful. The Baptist John the Baptist. The Baptist John. He went to the Baptist church down the street. John the Baptist said the most profound 7 words. He said, he must increase, and I must decrease. 7 words. He said he needs to become larger in my life. I need to give him more space in my heart. I need to give him more room in my mind. I need to push out those thoughts that are not of him so he can have more occupation in me. He needs to become greater. I need to become smaller. Can I finish the story from Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys? Somebody was saying in your mind, why did he finish that story? It's a good end. Because they eventually get thrown into the fiery furnace, right? And what happened in the midst of that fiery furnace? The one that put him in there goes, hold up a second. I thought we threw 3 in. How come I'm seeing 4? Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, that's true, O king. He said, look, a telescope. Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Do you understand that God became clear because the 3 Hebrew boys said, we want to magnify God, whether he delivers us or not, we're going to trust him. And it's the midst of that tribulation and that trial that God showed himself personally. I love that. Yeah, sometimes God will allow us to get center in the midst of a fire so Jesus can come alongside of us and be seen even clearer had we not been put in there in the first place. Verse 20, according to my earnest expectation, we're still in 20, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Now, I'm not trying to be morbid, but the remainder of the message will deal with death. Because how we view death will influence how we live life. Your theology of death will determine how you live the rest of your life. It is said that a man named Alfred Nobel, you may know that last name because he is the founder of what is known as the Nobel Prize. One of the main components of his prize is the Nobel Peace Prize. What many people do not know is that Alfred Nobel was a manufacturer of dynamite. And what changed his trajectory of being a creator or a munition manufacturer to being so focused on world peace was his brother passed away. And a bad reporter reported that it was Alfred's death. So he woke up one morning, picked up the newspaper, and read his own obituary. Can you imagine that? And what he read about himself was his legacy, that he was known as the merchant of death. And it moved him that if his legacy was going to be about what he created to destroy, he needed to realign his life so that it would be more about peace. So the Nobel Prize is given into areas of expertise for exceptional accomplishments in physics and chemistry and medical science and literature, and most importantly, peace to the international fraternity. And you say, what's that got to do with life or death? Well, consider him reading his obituary changed the way he was viewing life. Now, if you were to read your obituary, what would be said? What would be eulogized about you? Think about that. It's a morbid thought. You're reading your own obituary. Now, I could go into the direction of leaving a lasting legacy of faith, but I'm not going to. Where I'm going is, if I know that after life is real death, and the non-believer is going to be separated from God for eternity in a place called hell, Gehenna, and Jesus spoke more about Gehenna than he did about heaven, and I know that, then why aren't I living in light of that truth? If my theology of death is knowing that I'm going to have eternal peace with God, and the people that don't know him, those even in my life, but I'm not telling them about God, I'm not introducing my friends to Jesus because I'm ashamed, because I don't want them making fun of me, or I don't want them accusing me of being a Bible basher. Well, let me tell you something. I'd rather be called a Bible basher, a religious nut, than to not speak up when I know the Prince of Peace, the only one that can offer peace after life. Blessed are those who are peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. In other words, children of God are those who don't walk around making peace. It's those who introduce people to the only one who can create peace in the soul. The only one. So if Alfred Nobel could change his entire perspective because he saw the death impact, I'm saying if I know that much about death, why aren't I giving away my peace? Why aren't I evangelizing the people that I work with? What am I waiting for? Why aren't I sharing the gospel with my unsaved family? And I get it. I got a step up on you guys. I am a pastor, which makes the conversation go a little bit easier. I get into the conversation. Hey, man, what do you do for a living? I'm in marketing. What do you do for a living? I'm a pastor. Yep. You already know, man. Let's get this out of the way. You might not have that. But we have to start living in light of eternity. With the theology that I have of death, as a believer, I am guaranteed the best of both worlds. Because in Christ, listen to this, life and death aren't enemies, they're allies. When's the last time you heard that? You know, we have a real fear of death. We have a real fear. You ever been at a funeral? Both sides. A believer's funeral and a non-believer's funeral. And it's two entirely different presentations. It's two entirely different weights. Because the believer, though they're mourning, and though we grieve those we've lost, we have a hope that they are still alive beyond the grave. My theology of death tells me that out of the Word of God. So death is not an enemy for the believer. Death is an ally because of what Jesus accomplished. This is what Paul would write. Death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? He would write in verse 58, therefore, my beloved brethren and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. He says, in light of knowing that death can't touch you, go do work. Go do work for the Lord. Go tell others about him. Go live for him. Go talk to the people in your network about him. Paul comes to the conclusion in verse 21, his mission statement. He says, hey, for me, as far as I'm concerned, to live is Christ and to die is gain. So let's fill the blank. If you were to fill in the blank with that mission statement, if you were to say tonight, as for me, to live is blank, what would you put there? Think about it. As for me, to live is success. If you would filter all of your priorities into one word, what would it be? For to me, as far as I'm concerned, to live is suffering, man. My life's nothing but suffering. To live is survival. What would you put? For me, to live is health. Would you put health? Many would put wealth. For me, as far as I'm concerned, to live is wealth. You might know this name. I didn't. I had to do my research on him. His name was Howard Hughes. He was a very wealthy man his entire life. He inherited a lot of money. He got involved in so many different areas of life. Eventually, toward the latter years of his life, when he passed, he was worth $2.5 billion. But all the research I did and what I found about him, his latter years were spent in Las Vegas. And he jumped back and forth to different hotels. In fact, it was said that he bought, I forget the name of the hotel, he bought the entire hotel casino because there was a shiny slipper that was like illuminating, and it faced his penthouse. And because the light would shine into his penthouse suite, he wanted to buy the whole casino so he can remove that stinking slipper. That's what type of dude he was. But when he died, he left $2.5 million. And it said when the news went out in Las Vegas, all the casinos he was a part of, it said they announced over the PA system the passing of Howard Hughes. And we're going to ask that a moment of silence would be given to him. And all of the casino noise diminished. The coins, the machines, the music stopped. 60 seconds of silence until it was broke by a pit boss slamming the cards back down on the table, and the casinos roared again. And I'm saying 60 seconds of silence was all he left behind. I want my life to leave more than 60 seconds of silence. I want my life to leave a trail that leads back to God's presence. Amen. Now, this might not be indicative of where somebody is, but anytime I've heard of a family member or friend who lost their life, the first place I go is to their Facebook page. Because you see their last post. You see their pictures. And if you scroll down their news feed, you see what they were into. And I'm saying it gives you a thought on what it is that people would look at after we were gone. What would your Facebook news feed tell about you? Think about that. Now, that might not sum you up, but it will tell a story about what you've been involved in the past week, in the past month, in the past year. Will it leave a trail back to God? Because I don't know if you've been following the news lately, after the loss of Billy Graham, and you've seen the response globally, all walks of life, young, old, black, white, all types of religions, all type of cultures, all mourning the loss of this man. He was known as America's preacher to the presidents. Barack Obama tweeted about him. Bill Clinton commented about him. George Bush said some words about him. Do you understand what I'm saying? This man's trail points back to Jesus. His daughter was moved emotionally. Of course, she missed her daddy. But what she witnessed in the procession was all the types of people who were honoring her father's legacy. So that moved her to see so many different people. And the idea is, Billy Graham's ministry, the platform he stood on for all those years, was cross-cultural. How? Because he always focused on the cross. And every time he had any type of thing to say, he brought it back to Jesus. And Jesus said, listen, you can get caught up in all that other stuff, all the other causes. You can get caught up in doctrine. You can argue about denomination. You can talk about gun control. You can try to bring change policy-wise, governmental. It ain't about that. Jesus said, hey, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men to myself. The ministry that just propagates Jesus. The ministry that magnifies Christ. The life that says, I want to propagate and magnify Jesus, whether by my life or even in my death. God will draw people to himself through you. So for me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. This word gain here, it's a monetary term that means to make a profit on an investment. Think about that. As long as I'm living now for Christ, through Christ, by Christ, with Christ, it's all about Christ. My language that I use is going to be an honor to Christ. The things I look at magnify Christ. The things I do to make him larger, to make him more beautiful, make him bigger. That is an investment. And oh yeah, the loss of life is a return on my investment. It's a gain. Remember, you can't stop a man like Paul. How could you stop a man like Paul? No matter what you do to me, lock me up. I'm going to convert my jailer. Hey, whip me. I'm going to say I can boast because I'm suffering for Christ. He said, you can't touch me. Take my head off. To die is an upgrade. It's a gain. And I'm saying it's not necessarily the way we live life that is attractive for Christ. It's the way we recognize death. That's what's attractive. It's at a missionary family for generations. They reached a group, a tribe. They eventually were able to lead them to Jesus. So the entire culture of this tribe changed entirely. They flipped over. Now, one of the great granddaughters of this missionary's family decided to visit the tribe. She gets there. She gets to see the fruit of her great-grandparents' labor, and an elder who was a child when her great-grandparents were there approached her and said, I got to tell you a story. See, when your family first arrived here, they presented this foreign message, God becoming man, forgiveness of sins, and we wanted nothing to do with it. In fact, because it was so foreign, we started to poison their food. And one by one, they would die off. The elder then said, but what convinced us that their message was real wasn't the way they lived, it was the way we saw them die. There was something different about the way they died. Do you understand? For me to live is Christ. For me to die is gain because I have the proper theology of death and where I'll go. So we need not fear death, for it will not place us in a cemetery. It will usher us into God's sanctuary. You wrap your heart around that. Death will not place you in a cemetery. Death will actually usher you into God's presence and in his sanctuary. I love this scene. Jesus is standing before Pontius Pilate, and he's not answering him. Here you have the governor who's demanding an answer. And he says, hey, don't you know that I have authority over you? Don't you know I can have you crucified? Why aren't you answering me? Jesus, you have no authority over me. You have no authority over me. In fact, the one who I stand before, my Father, he's in control of this. Because then he went to the cross, and you know what he said? Church, you know he didn't say, I am finished. He said, it is finished. He said, my appointed time is finished, and I will yield up my spirit at the perfect time. Death did not take Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ took death. There's no such thing as an untimely death for a Christian. There is no such thing as an untimely death for a Christian. Don't care how they went out. The Bible confirms. Psalm 31:15, my times are in your hands. Psalm 139:16, all the days of my life are ordained for me in advance. Psalm 90:12, teach me to number my days that I may gain a heart of wisdom. The believer should have the best of both worlds. Paul understood being blameless leads to being bold for Jesus. He could not be put to shame because he had a proper perspective on being delivered, whether he got out of prison or whether he died in prison. For him to live was to magnify Christ. For him to die was to eventually be with Christ. You can't take out a person's peace who has that type of belief. I want to encourage you today to let you know that after this temporal life, this blink, this shadow, we will be with God forever. But let us live like that is a real hope. And since we're not dead, we're not done. We've heard it. Let's do it. God bless.